Right now, somewhere on this patch of water, barely wider than a small town, a decision is being made that will affect the price you pay for fuel, heating, and groceries. Not by a president, not by a CEO, by geography. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and it is, without exaggeration, the single most important and most fragile shipping corridor on the face of the earth. Now, here's what makes it genuinely terrifying. If it closes, even for a week, the global economy doesn't stumble. It seizes. So engineers and strategists asked a simple question. What if we could just go around it? The answer, more complicated than you can possibly imagine. Let's set the scene. The Persian Gulf is essentially a giant bathtub of crude oil. Around it, you'll find Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, and Iran, together holding the largest concentration of petroleum reserves anywhere on Earth. Every single drop of that oil destined for the outside world must exit through the same door, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow seaway that sits between southern Iran to the north and the Musandam Peninsula of Oman to the south. At its tightest point, the usable shipping lanes, the actual lanes where supertankers travel, measure just 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 miles. That in perspective, some commercial runways are longer than those lanes are wide. Through those two slim corridors passes roughly 1/5 of all the oil consumed by humanity every single day. That includes fuel for Europe, energy for Asia, and a significant portion of what powers the United States. Japan gets over 80% of its oil through here, South Korea, China. India, that heavily dependent now. What happens if something goes wrong? It doesn't take an all-out war. It never does. In 1984, during the Iran-Iraq War, over 400 ships were attacked in and around the Gulf, an event historians now call the Tanker War. Oil prices spiked. Shipping insurance rates exploded overnight. In 2019, tankers were attacked and seized again. Oil markets shuttered globally within hours. This is a waterway where a single burning ship, a stray mine, a drone strike on a key facility can send shockwaves through every economy on Earth within 48 hours. So the question isn't if this is a problem, it's why haven't we solved it? And to answer that, we need to talk about a plan that looks brilliant on paper and falls apart the moment you touch the ground. Look at a map of the region and something jumps out immediately. But it's the Musandam Peninsula, a rugged finger of Omani territory jutting into the strait, separates the Persian Gulf from the Gulf of Oman. And at its narrowest point, the distance across that landmass is surprisingly short. Depending on the route, you're looking at somewhere between 30 and 70 kilometers of terrain. On a map, it looks almost embarrassingly simple. Cut a canal through that land. Done. Ships bypass the strait entirely. No Iran, no geopolitical chokepoint, no crisis vulnerability, except, and this is where reality arrives uninvited, that land is not flat. The Musandam Peninsula is not gently rolling countryside. It is a geological nightmare. The Al-Hajar mountain range cuts directly through this region, featuring peaks that rise sharply from sea level to over 1,500 meters. That's nearly 5,000 feet. In an almost vertical ascent, when this isn't like digging through soft Egyptian desert like the Suez Canal, this is blasting through some of the hardest limestone and dolomite rock formations on the planet. For reference, the Panama Canal, considered one of the greatest engineering feats in human history, took over a decade, cost thousands of lives, and required moving more earth than any project before it. And Panama's terrain was relatively cooperative. The Musandam Canal would dwarf that challenge. Engineering estimates, though no official study has been fully commissioned, suggest a project of this scale could cost anywhere from $200 billion to over $1 trillion, depending on depth requirements, tunneling versus open-cut methods, and the necessary port infrastructure on each end. And the environmental toll? The Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman host remarkably sensitive marine ecosystems. Drilling and blasting through tens of kilometers of mountain would generate dust, runoff, and vibration on a scale that scientists say could devastate coral reefs, disrupt fish migration, and permanently alter tidal flow patterns between two connected bodies of water. These aren't hypothetical concerns. They're the baseline expectations of anyone who's studied comparable megaprojects. But let's say Hypothetically, you solve the engineering, you find the money, you manage the environmental impact. You still have three massive problems. Problem one, who's in charge? Oman owns the Musandam Peninsula, and Oman is a sovereign nation with its own foreign policy, economy, and strategic interests. The Sultanate of Oman has historically played a careful, neutral role in Gulf politics. It's one of the few nations that maintained diplomatic ties with both Iran and Western powers simultaneously. Building a canal of this magnitude on their territory would require Oman to essentially allow their land to become the backbone of global energy infrastructure permanently. That's not a permit application. That's a negotiation involving dozens of nations, international law, security guarantees, and revenue-sharing arrangements that would take decades to untangle. Problem two, who pays? Funding at this scale doesn't come from a single country or company. It would require a coalition of nations, likely including the US, EU, China, Japan, South Korea, and Gulf states, agreeing not only to fund the construction, but to the ongoing governance and maintenance of the canal for the next century. History suggests these kinds of international megaprojects rarely survive first contact with political reality. Problem three, and this is the most counterintuitive part, the part most people miss. Does it even solve the problem? Even if the Musandam Canal existed tomorrow, fully built, fully operational, it would not eliminate the choke point problem. It would duplicate it. Now, instead of one narrow corridor that hostile actors, rogue states, or terrorist groups could target, you have two. And a canal, unlike a wide-open sea lane, is dramatically easier to disrupt. Block one end with a scuttled ship, damage a lock mechanism, strike the infrastructure with a missile, and the entire canal becomes useless. The Suez Canal was blocked for 106 days in 1956, and again more recently in 2021 by a single grounded container ship, affecting global trade within hours. A mountain canal with complex hydraulic infrastructure would be far more fragile than Suez. You would have built a trillion-dollar alternative route that is, in many ways, more vulnerable than the one it was meant to replace. The Musandam Canal idea reveals something profound about how the modern world actually works. We have built a global civilization, 8 billion people, trillions of dollars in annual trade, entire national economies, on top of an infrastructure that runs through a handful of extraordinarily narrow geographic bottlenecks. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Turkish Straits, the Strait of Gibraltar. Together, these corridors handle a staggering percentage of world trade, and each of them, every single one, can be disrupted by conflict, accident, or political crisis. There are no real alternatives fully ready to replace any of them. Shipping routes that bypass these straits are either too long to be economically viable or too underdeveloped to handle the volume. The Arctic route, often proposed as an alternative to Hormuz for Asian markets, its only navigable part of the year, requires icebreaker escort and lacks the port infrastructure to handle supertankers. We are, in a very real sense, a civilization that runs on choke points, and the Strait of Hormuz is the most critical of all of them, because the commodity flowing through it isn't just trade, it's energy. The kind that heats homes, powers hospitals, and runs the supply chains that put food on shelves. When strategists, engineers, and economists study the Musandam Canal, they're not being naive, they're being desperate. The canal idea exists because serious people understand just how terrifying the alternative is. A world where a single crisis in a 2-mile-wide passage between Iran and Oman can send shockwaves through every economy on Earth simultaneously. For now, the Strait of Hormuz remains exactly what it has always been, irreplaceable and breathtakingly exposed. The canal remains a dream, a compelling, logical, and ultimately unrealizable dream, a testament to just how deeply we've engineered ourselves into dependence on geography we cannot control. So, what do you think? Is there a version of the Musandam Canal that could actually work? Or is the Strait of Hormuz simply a problem without a real solution? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and this is the kind of topic where the conversation gets genuinely fascinating. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden systems that run our world is something you're into, You're going to want to subscribe and hit the bell because we cover things like this every day. The engineering failures, the geopolitical pressure points, and the fragile, invisible infrastructure that most people never think about until it breaks. And if you want to keep going, right now, the video on screen walks through the dark truth about Apollo that NASA buried for decades. See you there.